Scotland has a fascinating history, but many people don't realise that Scotland almost became a colonial empire. So what happened there and why did it fail? Well, in 1698, the Darien scheme proposed that the Scots would settle a part of South America called the Darien Gap. It's situated here in Central America and it's today a part of Panama. This would see the foundation of New Caledonia, a Scottish colony to tell the world that the Scots were in business. The English had Plymouth, the Spanish had, well, most of South America, nominally anyway. The Dutch had New Amsterdam, about which I've made some videos recently, and the Scots would have New Caledonia, their special colony to prove to the world that they meant business. Now the story starts in 1698, but as ever it really starts before that in 1603 with the death of the English Queen Elizabeth I. This meant that a Scotsman came to the throne of England, and not just any Scotsman, but the King of Scotland, King James VI, who then became King James VI and first at the same time. The sixth King of Scotland called James and the first King of England. This was because he descended from a former English king, Henry VII, who I've also made videos about, and so he could rule both nations. But just because he was the king of both, this was a personal union, not a political union. They maintained their separateness. And this was probably for the best, because England and Scotland throughout the years had not really got along very well. At this period in time, England had over 5 million inhabitants, while Scotland barely boasted 1 million. And in 1639, a period of violence called the English, British, or perhaps the War of the Three Kingdoms erupted throughout the island of Britain and indeed of Ireland. And initially the main Scottish faction known as the Covenanters would fight against the king, against King Charles, who was the son of that King James. But towards the end of the conflict they switched sides and aided the king against the parliamentarian faction that would eventually become led by Oliver Cromwell. While the Scots would go on to lose that rather spectacularly, in 1660 the king was reinstated, Charles II came to the throne, and Scotland entered a bit of a period of decline. This was because Scotland was being overshadowed by its English neighbour, who simply kept getting wealthier and more populous while Scotland was lagging behind. The situation was only made worse when the relationship added a third into the kingdom. This was of course the Netherlands in 1688 after the Glorious Revolution, when the Dutch Stadtholder became King of England and Scotland. There were some who weren't happy with this arrangement, notably those in favour of the former King James II, and because his Latin name was Jacobus, they became known as the Jacobites. Now, if you were a Jacobite, a supporter of the now exiled Stuart family, this was a period you'd rather forget. Now, you might not be a Jacobite, but I'm sure there's still plenty of information online about you that you wish was rather not there. That's why the sponsor of today's video, you didn't see this one coming, Incogni, can help. Increasing data breaches mean even supposedly secure passwords and other information is vulnerable online. Incogni tracks down and removes your personal data from multiple sites, including online directories, people search sites, and even commercial databases. That's because data brokers collect and sell your data without your consent. Incogni continually monitors the internet and repeatedly removes your data from unauthorized sites. All you have to do is create your account, authorize Incogni to remove your data, and sit back as you disappear from the internet. With Incogni, you reduce the risk of scams, protect your online and offline privacy, and take back control of your own personal data. Take back your personal data with Incogni. Use code HILBERT in the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Remember, they can't harm you if they can't find you. The Dutch had in 1602 created the VOC, or the East India Trading Company, to bring spices and other goods from the East, particularly today's Indonesian Malay Peninsula, back to the Dutch Republic to sell at ridiculously high profits. They were actually 2 years behind the English, who had founded the English East India Company in 1600, but they were a bit lame, especially compared to the Dutch in this period. They were both bringing back a lot of wealth though. That's the key takeaway here. And this was one of the reasons why, apart from its larger population and better geography in relation to the rest of Europe, England was far exceeding Scotland in their partnership. Now in 1661, the English had made it even harder for the Scots to cash in on this lucrative trade by banning Scottish ships from docking in English ports. And it's for this reason why the Scots Parliament and Scots in general felt they needed to respond to address their grievances on the world stage, but also their flagging economy. In 1695, they founded the Bank of Scotland, for instance, which still exists. Hooray for Scotland. And the same year, they founded the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. Not quite as sort of rolling off the tongue as VOC, for example, but hey-ho, they're giving it a go. We have quite a lot of their logs from meetings that they had with one another, and so we can read what they said in their opening statement about what their intention was. They said, and particularly beside the kingdoms and countries of Europe, to the East and West Indies, the Straits, and to trade in the Mediterranean, or upon the coast of Africa, or in the northern parts, or elsewhere as above. So it's a very specific brief where they're going to trade, and this is something that we'll come across later with the company, that they don't really outline their goals particularly well. That said, most Scots didn't read the small print, and many Scots invested into this trading company, thinking that it would take off just like the Dutch and English East India companies. They raised around £400,000, which was a huge amount of money in the late 17th century. Today it would be about £60 million, and it's thought that anywhere up to around a half of capital in Scotland was invested in this company. But what would they spend the money on? Well, a man named William Paterson came to the fore. He was a Scottish trader who had a lot of wacky ideas, and possibly his wackiest idea involved this piece of land called the Darien Gap. Now, the Darien Gap is in today's Panama, and his idea essentially was create a colony there, and you can link up the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific, which has huge trading potential. Now, as you can see from the map, it's a fair way to go overland between the Atlantic and the Pacific, but really his idea wasn't too bad. I mean, that ultimately is the idea behind the Panama Canal today. They would import thousands of slaves to be worked in brutal conditions in order to tap into the gold mines that were there, selling the gold on to fund the venture further, and thus being able to eventually link up the two seas and to control trade in the region. That was the Darien scheme, and in 1698, over 1,000 Scots men and women boarded on several ships and departed for the New World. When they arrived, they named the land New Caledonia, and as you can see on this map here, the capital of this colony was to be called New Edinburgh. But when they got there, they discovered that this was not much like the old Edinburgh, but quite a lot worse. The soil proved hard and ill-suited for European modes of agriculture, but much worse, and especially in the summer months, were the diseases. The mosquitoes that carried malaria soon began to take their toll on the population, and the traders, the Dutch and the English who were sailing up and down the coast, proved to be entirely uninterested in what the Scots had to offer, as did the local inhabitants living on land, who, while they weren't fans of Spain, also didn't really want to buy fried Mars bars and haggis. So from the 1,200 that had set sail, only around 300 survived, and in 1699 limped away to New York for provisions. Another expedition was, however, mounted, and this was because while the first colony had been an absolute shambles, the messages that they had sent in letters back to Scotland were entirely optimistic, trying to lure new settlers to come over instead of telling the truth. And so another shipload of around 1,000 Scots, under the command of Alexander Campbell of Fonab, went to found a second colony in New Caledonia. He decided what the flagging colony needed was an enemy, and the enemy that he set his sights upon were the Spaniards. Now, the Spaniards had a nearby fort which the Scots attacked, and this will become important for the rest of the story and actually explain a lot of what's been going wrong up until now, because the Spanish had pretty much decided that all of the Americas, apart from a bit that went to Portugal, was actually theirs, and that included Central America and the Darien Gap, where these Scots were now living. So they obviously weren't too pleased about the Scots, but the Scots, being largely Calvinists, weren't too bothered about what these papist Spaniards made of it all. They were going to seize bits of land, just like the English and the Dutch had been doing. Now, what's interesting is that archival research in Spain in 2003 actually showed that the Spanish would have gone on to attack these Scots in significant force if they hadn't given up their colony. They almost certainly would not have been able to withstand. The Spanish, of course, had taken over large parts of South and Central America starting in the 16th century, and by the 17th century into the 18th century, they were really consolidating their power across most of the South. So why did the Darien Gap eventually fail? As it did, the Scots left it entirely, abandoned it after just a few years. Well, to find out why, really a big reason is 10 years before the start of the Darien scheme, which has already been mentioned in the video. It's the 1688 Glorious Revolution. It was also the start of the 9 Years' War, which was a conflict that brought many of the powers of Europe, including those that had colonial empires, into conflict with one another. And now King William III of England and Scotland was also the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, and he found himself in alliance with the Spanish against the French. And it is for this reason that he didn't want to risk antagonizing the Spaniards by supporting the fledgling Scots, who were essentially claiming part of the Spanish Empire in Panama. And that's essentially why one of the reasons the Company of Scotland never received state backing like the Dutch VOC and the English East India Company had. And it's explained why in this address to the meeting of the company. It is with regret the king tells you that he cannot agree to assert the right of the Indian and African Company's colony in Darien. He perfectly knows the earnest desire of those concerned in it, and of many others of his good subjects, and does his servants justice in that matter. His Majesty would certainly have granted what was so pressingly desired, had he not known that his yielding that point must have disturbed the peace of Europe and engaged us in a war in which he could expect no support. There's also the fact that King William wasn't a huge fan of the Scots at this point, and this has a lot to do with the Jacobites who we mentioned earlier, given that there were incessant uprisings in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, against his rule. And he said, "I have been ill served in Scotland, but I hope some remedies may be found to prevent the inconveniences which may arise from this act." So King William was not a fan of the Darien scheme and didn't support it, and this probably also is why English and Dutch merchants stayed away, and while they watched as the scheme floundered around and eventually collapsed and failed. Part of it too was an idea that was very relevant in the 17th and indeed into the 18th century called mercantilism. This is the idea that there is only a finite amount of wealth, and so what there is, one has to take. So sharing is not a good idea. And the English and Dutch merchants would rather they were the ones making the profits rather than the Scots. So what effect did the failure of this colony have? Well, quite a lot actually. It's one of the reasons why Scotland became very embittered going forward into the 18th century, as around half of the capital had been invested into this scheme, which went up in smoke. It actually caused a huge economic crisis in Scotland with the need to repay on several of these debts. It meant that the country went bankrupt, and in 1707 it also meant that the Act of Union, which would see that personal union between England and Scotland become a political union, thus leading to the Kingdom of Great Britain, was passed. And so the two nations became one. Now, it's interesting to wonder, had the Darien scheme been successful and had that colony led to an uptick in Scottish trade and finances, it's very well likely that the two nations would not have joined together to create Great Britain in the end. So this is an interesting question of history. But ultimately, things didn't work out that way. The Darien scheme was a fiasco, and probably always was going to be. The distance between the two oceans was simply too large. The Scots were ill-informed about colonial politics. The Spaniards, as we mentioned, were very determined not to allow the Scots to remain there, and so it seems like it was always doomed to failure. In any case, let me know about if you enjoyed the video. Did you know about the Darien scheme and Scotland's failed attempt to get a bit of Panama for themselves? What would Panama be like if the Scots had succeeded? Would there be haggis, tacos? Would there be kilts and sombreros? Do they wear sombreros in Panama? There's probably not. Probably edit that out, future Hilbert. Anyway, it would be an interesting mix of cultures in any case. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'm Hilbert. This was The History. Thank you to all my patrons, and see you all in the next one. Take back your personal data with Incogni. Use code Hilbert in the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Remember, they can't harm you if they can't find you.